thank you, Kevin, for coming to visit us and talking your story. This is an excellent story. Please, now, let's hear.
Okay, as just a little bit about myself more. So, my name's Kevin Brokoff. I work for CGI, which is one of the largest consulting firms in the world. Offices all over the world, and been doing this for more years than I care to imagine or talk about. So, and tonight I'm going to talk about how we are taming security vulnerabilities and doing tech debt remediation in large enterprises. So as you saw, my subtitle was Outrunning the Feature Request Stream, and that's always the challenge. There's always features coming in all the time that got to be dealt with. They got to, and so it's, you always got your net time needs to be spent on this. And at the same time, the bad guys have all the new tools too. And so new vulnerabilities are coming in at an even faster rate. And technology is changing at an even faster rate than it ever has before. I mean, it's just amazing how much money is pouring into the generative AI thing. And the answer to all that is speed. Speed is the key because you got to outrun now all that stuff coming in, or you get started on something and then you got to go drop off and go deal with this other stuff, and by the time you get back to it, everything's changed again and you got to start over, and you end up with 5 different applications that or systems that are all targeted the same thing, where you started out with one and then you started developing a second one, and then before you got that done you did the third, fourth, fifth. So speed is the key. So tonight I'm going to talk about ways to dramatically speed up doing this stuff. And so is the answer AI agents? I mean, that's all you hear about these days. And there's some problems with using AI agents only. First of all is that with generative AI, your results are indeterminate. So, you apply an AI agent to the same code base 3 times, you're going to get 3 different results. And, even the best ones, there's always a disclaimer at the end. Generative LLMs can sometimes hallucinate. Be sure to check everything. And, another issue is scalability. I mean, yeah, like I mentioned Amazon Q CLI, and there's a lot of other stuff like that. You can do that on one repo, but how do you turn around and do that on 5,000 repos? So, especially when human has to review every line of code. And then also with the agents, there's no way to necessarily trace. So it's, you really don't know why it did it completely. So, but if you combine AI agents with deterministic tools like Open Rewrite, then you use the AI agents combined with the human, and you're very focused on just generating those rules, your rules-based transformers or recipes. And then you can take those rule-based transformers and run them reliably, do mass application of your changes across thousands of repos. You don't have to go check all that because you know exactly what you're going to get up front. And in addition, by doing that, every change is traceable, it's version controlled, it's testable, all that. So the two together make an amazing combination. So one of the most useful of these deterministic rule-based transformer tools is the open source project Open Rewrite, which is sponsored by Modern, which is a internet startup with the founders that live in Miami even. So I'm sure most or all of you I know some of you are very familiar with Open Rewrite, but I'm going to give like a little introduction to it in case somebody hasn't. Um, so what is Open Rewrite? It is, they call themselves an open source automated refactoring ecosystem for source code. And their engine runs recipes. They call them recipes. And how it works is that they parse the code. It parses the code into something that they've labeled lossless semantic tree. So think about an abstract syntax tree. If you remember back from your computer science days, you know, you end up with this hierarchical thing. So what happens with a compiler then is, you know, after it does that, it'll add type information to every one of those nodes. So that's the second step for the lossless semantic tree. And then the third step that nobody else does, as far as I know, is they add all the formatting information to it. So you could parse it out into this tree and then write it back out, and it will be identical character by character if you didn't make any changes. So that turns out to be really powerful. And the other thing, like I keep emphasizing, is the modification to deterministic. You apply it 1,000 times, you're going to get exactly the same results every single time. They also supply, and on top of the engine, then there's a lot of these common recipe tasks, like around framework migrations, security fixes, stylistic consistency kind of stuff. And there's thousands of those. And their original focus was on the Java ecosystem. Open Rewrite itself is written in Java, and so that was the big focus to start with, but they're gradually expanding support to other languages. And then the Modern provides their commercial platform, which is designed to run recipes at scale, manage and run recipes at scale, and do all the stuff around that. So what parts make up the open source part is first is the core that I mentioned. It's Apache license, so very friendly to enterprises and everybody else. It's you know, primarily maintained by Modern employees, but there's a lot of community contributions to it too, and it's all bundled up in jars, published out on Maven Central, so you know it's easy to pull down. There's also all those open source recipes for, you know, basic modifications on, well, you know, all the common stuff that, you know, if you're a Java programmer, you use, and, you know, gradually covering other languages too. And that's also Apache license, and the same kind of thing, community maintained, published on Maven. The other part of the open source ecosystem is there's a number of open source, or even some commercial, I guess, libraries and platforms that maintain their own recipes for doing upgrades for their platform. And this is a very powerful thing. And so some of those that do that is the Micronaut project, Quarkus, Apache Camel, Oracle WebSlug, IBM Liberty. And then finally, there's a Gradle and Maven plugins, and this is again Apache license, community maintained. Then there's the Modern platform, which is the paid portion of it, and so there's a number of components to that. The first one is their CLI, and you know, that's for running on your terminal or laptop. CI/CD build pipelines has multiple modes, so you can use it, you know, just like on a local repository, you know, just to apply recipes to it. It also serves as a client to their DX and SaaS products, and you know, you have to have a license key to use that. Modern DX is their on-premise version of their system, which doesn't have all the features of the SaaS platform, but it does enable you to do mass refactoring, or, you know, refactoring at scale. So you could say, you know, apply this recipe to, you know, every repo, qualifying repo in my, you know, my source code system. And it's air gap capable. So it's, you know, it can be set up. It doesn't even need to go out to the internet for anything. And then there's the SaaS platform, which they run single tenant for their big customers and then multi-tenant for open source projects and the smaller ones. And it has all the capabilities of DX, plus they cache all the LSTs and just do incremental updates. Well, I guess DX does it too, but then they took the obvious thing of calculating embeddings on all those LSTs, and it gives you semantic search like way better than you could imagine for anything else. So that could be a really powerful thing just in and of itself. And then the Dev Center, which is a bunch of the UI on the SaaS platform. So that's for managing, remediations at scale. So you can track, you can manage your recipe catalog and track how your batch remediations go on. All kinds of, because this kind of stuff you need to do it at scale. They also provide a bunch of commercial recipes, which are really complex stuff that's not available from the open source. So you get those too. And finally, they have a JetBrains plugin that you can, operate all that stuff from your IDE. So the use cases for Moderna open rewrite are, like we've been talking, technical debt remediations, including security vulnerabilities. You can use it for tech modernization stuff, the client upgrade recipe per framework or library release, and then the search and intelligence. And so I'm going to hop out here and just give you a little demo in case you haven't seen it, how it works. So here's the open rewrite docs, just out of docs.openrewrite.org. And they got a recipe catalog out here. So if we go down to, as you can see, they cover, lots of different frameworks and programming languages. And if we go down here to Java, we're going to look at this remove unused imports. So, which be a common thing. Pretty simple thing to do, but pretty common. So if, so here in the catalog tells you what it does, and, all the info, and then here's all the different ways you can run it. So we're going to use the Maven command line here. We'll just copy this, come over here. So this is the source code for the new open rewrite training curriculum that I'm working on right now for CGI. So anyway, so we'll just run it on this, and this is just a little Java app. So run that like so. Just execute another Maven plugin, basically. And as you can see, it reported out here and what changes it made. And let's see here, it changed 2 files. And if we do git diff, see here, it deleted a couple of imports. So, okay. So that's a very simple quick introduction. So I will hop back over to the presentation. Before we jump into this story, any questions or comments on what I presented so far? All right. Very well. And I will start on my tale of a security vulnerability stream. And so, you got the feature request coming in, you got CVs coming in, it's roiling the waters. And this is at one of our Fortune 500 clients is where this is from. So like many large corporations, there's been lots of mergers, acquisitions, and so you got a big mix of cultures, operating philosophies, and it's constantly changing, and they're trying to integrate people, and everybody's got their, the way they like to do things, and so you end up, they end up with, you know, hundreds of development teams in offices scattered out all over the country, and they got thousands and thousands or tens of thousands of workloads. And one of the kind of cohesive large groups in that organization has this philosophy of the governance of guidelines, just very broad guidelines, and every team can do whatever they want to. Another large chunk of the organization had this whole philosophy is we're going to lock everything down. We're going to tell you do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and just go do it. And so they ended up with this big portfolio of Java applications that are, just very similar. And so, so these groups are fighting with each other, and it's just the way it is in a large organization. But then Cloudburst hit. So two of them, in fact. So the first thing is that over on the infrastructure and purchasing side, they decided that the Pivotal Cloud Foundry came to them and said, "Oh, we're going to jack up your price by 2 or 3 times." And plus, they were running into they'd gotten really a lot of benefit from Pivotal Cloud Foundry to move them along a long ways, but they were hitting up against the limits of it now. So they decided, okay, we got to move everything to Kubernetes. So, and the U.S. government is one of their biggest customers. So everything they do that's on the cloud, it has to be either FedRAMP moderate or compliant, or else the DoD equivalent, which is called IL2. Meanwhile, over the Cybersecurity Information Protection Department decided that they needed to do a container security audit, since the number of workloads on Kubernetes was increasing greatly. And they immediately determined that they did have a container image scanner working at one time, and all of the software engineering senior directors got together and demanded that it be shut off because it was interfering with delivering features. So just get rid of those pesky messages. We just don't want to think about it. Anyway, the audit team came in and did this big, huge audit, and fancy. This was another big consulting firm, not CGI, but one of our competitors did this, and had nice PowerPoints of all the stuff. And so one of the first things they were able to do is get a new container image scanner going, and voila, average containers got 80 to 100 vulnerabilities. And so we got to be FedRAMP compliant. Can't have those vulnerabilities. Got to get it fixed. So we got a problem. So here's how a small team, there was like, 4 or 5 of us most of the time doing this. We were able to get a handle on this whole thing. So when we got assigned this task, the first thing we did was to decide to identify, what do we need to do? What do we want to do first to get the biggest bang for the buck? And so those 3,000 plus applications that were on PCF that got migrated, well, a bunch of them got sunsetted. So because we found out didn't need them anymore, so ended up with about 2,700 of those applications. And since they're all in the same Java framework, we could do a fix for one, it'll fix the 2,700, all 2,700. So we thought that would be a really good one to start with. And the other part of that is that a lot of the FedRAMP compliant stuff was in that group, and the Java framework that they were all based on, most of them had used whatever the latest version was when they created the application, and it never changed it since, and it was like years behind. And if we could just get everybody up to the latest version of the Java framework, that a lot of those vulnerabilities would just go away, because all the dependencies would get on much newer versions. And the other choice was is that one of my other teams at this client, we were like the coaches and the paving the golden brick road for the PCF migration. So been working with all these teams and had a good reputation with them. So if I said something, they would listen to me. So we decided that's where we would target first. And to do the actual modifications, we decided to use Open Rewrite. We'd actually looked at it at the PCF, talked about it during the PCF migration of making the changes to the applications so they would run in containers on Kubernetes. We never did get around to it. The steps for that migration, there was probably 300 steps that you had to do that migration, for all those 2,700 apps. So it was a big deal. But anyway, we got introduced to Open Rewrite that way and decided this is the answer to this problem. So then we went out gathering data. So we went to the scanner system and looked at all that to get a sense of what the issues were, which we kind of already did that before we decided on the MVP. That's why we knew the Java framework thing would fix it. We found that the team that maintains the Java framework had very good release notes. It was, every release they said, okay, here's what you need to modify, here's what's changed, here's what dependencies changed, all that. So it was very good. And we figured that we could just go down line by line and create recipes for each line, and it was going to do a really good, get us a long way there. And then finally, just to find out what the scope of the problem was, I went out and I wrote a Python script just to scrape the source code management systems and to find out what versions they were on. And here was what came back. So this is counts by major versions, and the horizontal line is how many days old. So you can see it's years and years old. And I mean, this stuff, probably the first, I'd say the first 7 of those would be like Spring Boot 1.5. And you can see some of the major releases were more minor than the others, and where it was really required a lot of changes. That's where those big spikes are. They got stuck. They can't get past it because it take too much work. And so when we looked at this, we thought, well, let's start with the 1492 one here. If we can get that over the hump and get everything to the left of that or the right of that, move to the latest, then that's a big win, and it would be less, doesn't require that much work, and then we'll go back and pick up the rest of these. So we started working on that. At the same time, we started developing recipes. We started doing internal marketing because we got to sell hundreds of teams on doing this. So we had a bunch of meetings to build consensus. We talked with the container security audit team, which they were found they were very frustrated because they had this nice, huge PowerPoint presentation and nobody was doing anything. And they were just felt like they were talking to a wall. We went and talked to cybersecurity, and they had been trying to do some stuff themselves, and they're not developers. They were just spinning their wheels, so they were very interested. Talked to the container platform engineering team that's responsible for the Kubernetes clusters, and of course they're very interested in it. And then we talked to the team that maintains the Java framework. So we got them all on board. We hit up the leadership to make sure we had funding, and then we went out and found a couple of friendly pilot teams that would work with us and figuring out what the bugs were before we rolled it out to everybody else. And so we got that all done. And as we got along, actually got a couple of pilot teams started testing the recipes we had to do, that we had done so far. And then we had a big kickoff rollout thing at that point. So we had this presentation, and we showed all the CVs and what they were, emphasized, hey, FedRAMP says you got to get these fixed. We did a calculation that it was going to cost $24 million to do this all manually. It just, every team just went out, did their own fixes. And we showed off, like the demo I did with the open rewrite that I did earlier. And we then demoed some of our first custom recipes and the execution scripts that went with them, to get everybody fired up, and off we went. So some of the interesting things from as we were developing the recipes, which, it was pretty substantial. I would say, we ended up with what Open Rewrite calls composite recipes. So we had a composite recipe for each major version release. So there's quite a few of those, and there would be 20 to 40 recipes making up each one of those composite recipes. And then the custom recipes, we did probably at least 20 of those. So anyway, so the first thing we found was that the Open Rewrite documentation was just not enough, and there really wasn't a lot of training material. So I had basically on one of my work, laptops, I had like all of the Open Rewrite code base checked out and just all open in the IDE all the time, and just going back there, looking at it constantly to figure out, okay, how do you do this? Another thing we found out with that is that the Open Rewrite takes a kind of a not typical approach, and that a lot of enterprise Java developers they really couldn't get their head wrapped around it with it. They just never really got it, and especially if they had no background in the Gang of Four patterns, because most of it's based on the visitor pattern from Gang of Four. Another interesting thing is that a lot of those open source recipes make the assumption that you know how to configure Maven and keep it up to date. And so we go to run those recipes and boom. So we ended up developing some of our own recipes to go in and fix all basically get Maven to best practices, like Maven is expected to be, and also go in and fix a bunch of the Java problems, especially around like logging frameworks. And then we another good piece of that Maven thing was that direct dependencies weren't listed, and so you can figure out the other recipes can figure out. So anyway, we came out, did that first. So that, the instructions were you need to upgrade this repository first. You run this to get it standardized, and then you run the upgrade recipes, and that worked pretty well. Another interesting thing, if you look at the rewrite code, they've got their own test framework, rewrite test, and but what we did is we would just like go out and get actual files that we wanted to upgrade and drop them in and just load them for our unit test. So that, and once you got that system set up, you're going along, and all of a sudden you hit an edge case that doesn't work. You just take the file that failed, drop it in, add another unit test. You got it fixed. All right, so it's that works really well for a lot of stuff. Another thing we did was create unit integration tests, that would just like do end to end, and that turned out to be really useful because there was some weird behavior on the Open Rewrite Maven plugin that couldn't figure out what was going on. But we could debug through the unit tests and figured it out. We provided Bash and PowerShell scripts for each of the major version upgrades, so there wasn't like a long list of instructions you had to follow. It's just like run the script. And finally, once we got all the recipes done to get it up to the latest version of the Java framework, we turned the whole thing over to the Java framework team to support and do new recipes. So from that point on, every time they did a major release, they released a recipe at the same time to upgrade to that version of their recipe or of the framework. So, retrospective on that first go round, what went well, we were able to fix a lot of the repos without having to do any manual code fixes. The recipes took care of everything, just like a charm. It was a very reasonable cost that we were able to do this. Like maybe I think it was like $250,000 or something. It was cheap by enterprise standards. It was cheap to do that, and the handoff to the Java framework team went very, very well. They've done a great job with it since then. What didn't go so good is that when we're providing support, usually what these product development teams would do is they would take the newest person on the team or the most junior developer and say, hey, go do this because we're busy delivering features. And and a lot of those people have no clue on Maven other than I do MVN clean install kind of stuff. And so we would get support questions that had nothing to do with what the recipes were doing at all. It's like, well, I followed your directions. My build broke. You got to fix it for me now, kind of thing. So that that took up a lot of time. We had to go through a number of engineers to find ones that could actually deliver recipes, and I don't know that we've got that all figured out yet. On how to train people to do that, and then just managing that. There were big changes and managing across that so many different repos. I mean, that was just a huge headache, and it turned out our whole scripts idea was just a headache, especially on Windows machines. It's just didn't work that well. Anyway, so after we got that all going, other stuff came up. So I'm going to cover a couple of those things. The next two that came after that. First one was back to the PCF migration again. So none of these teams knew anything about Kubernetes, and so when they go to requesting resources, they think it's like asking IT operations for a VM. Get it big enough that I don't ever have a problem. And so ended up wildly over provisioning the Kubernetes pods. Most of the average CPU utilization on the clusters was like 3%. And because of that, all of a sudden the data center Kubernetes clusters needed to buy another $3 million worth of hardware. And so that got everybody's attention. So they come to us and said, what can you do? We can fix that. And so we developed this, it was a single recipe. I think it was a single recipe. Anyway, but it was like thousands of lines of code that basically integrated with the observability platform, and to go grab the actual CPUs for this particular application, and do a bunch of calculations, figure out where to set the resource or the resource requests and limits at. And we did it. No additional hardware needed to be purchased, and saved a bunch of development costs too, but that's kind of soft costs. But the $3 million is a hard number, so everybody understood that. Then the next thing that came up just as that was ending is that they were getting ready to shut down the PCF clusters, and they discovered that they'd been running proxies out to Lawrence Darkly on there, and none of the teams had changed their configuration. So this is basically a Spring property change or Spring Boot property change, basically, to go point at the new proxies that are in the Kubernetes clusters. But it was panic because they're shut down. Like, we don't have much time. And so we were able to get this all knocked out in a week. Um, so that was another, didn't take a lot of work, but it was a big success. And so, what was our retrospective after that? Well, what went well is, we ditched the scripts and we wrote a little Go CLI, to do the searching of repos to find, searching of the source code management system, find what repos to do it on, and then, actually apply the recipes across multiple repos, create the PRs, all that. That worked really well. I wrote up this big long tutorial on how to configure JVMs on Kubernetes and put the link to that in the PRs, and that a lot of people found that very helpful and helped them understand why they needed to do it this way. The senior director that the team is under had this dedicated project management team. So they took over, going after all these, after the PRs were created, going after all the teams. Say, hey, have you looked at this PR? Have you merged it? All that, tracking who had done it, who had, which was, pretty costly, but it did get multiple teams involved in this big win that, so, it, it worked out because, everybody's had, a whole bunch of people get the glory, and so they're all happy about it. What didn't go so well? The simple stuff like the Kubernetes, changing the resource requests and limits, it's fairly simple. And the Spring Boot property change, which is really simple. I mean, that was really straightforward to do that with this, how we did it. And that one of the things that slowed us down some was, searching across all the code repos to find the ones we needed to operate on, because there's limits on this was on-prem GitHubs, and so there's API limits. So we had to, like check 1, check 2, check 3. So it took hours to do that. So, if there was only a SaaS platform that could do all this for us. And then still struggling with identifying engineers who could write recipes and how to train them, so forth. And so that's the story today. Any questions or comments at this point?
We have a couple questions, Kevin.
Okay.
Hey, Percy, haven't seen you in a long time. Percy's asking 24 million to fix how many CVEs in total?
It would be approximately 90 times 2,700.
90, so that's the average 90.
Yeah.
That's a big number. A big number. Percy, you okay? Do you want more details on that? Let's go to Daryl. Daryl has a question. Hey, Daryl. He's basically asking about the size of the team. Was your team of 5 fully focused on this one problem? That's the question.
Yes. Yes. Other than myself, yes, they were just focused on this problem for, the 3 or 4 months we took to do this.
Oh, okay. So we have Mina. Hey, Mina. We've got a question about what's the unit test coverage percentage for these systems before addressing these problems?
All over the place. It wasn't horrible. Most of them, it wasn't horrible. I would say 95% of them did have at least some unit tests. And it didn't really, with the kind of changes that were being made, we didn't really run into any issues there that I know of. They were pretty minor. If you, ran it, compiled, you were good to go, basically. So.
Okay, I'm sure we have more questions. Daryl, I see you, so that means that
Oh.
you're thinking of something.
Okay, well, let me go on to,
I've got tons of questions.
yeah, all right, let me go on, let me finish then, all right?
Yeah,
So-
go ahead.
Okay,
So what's the roadmap going forward now? What are we working on now? So over at the client, we are working on getting Modern into the organization, which that's a ordeal to buy anything, bring anything new in there. So it's going to take a while, but we're working on it. Which will, help a lot. Another thing that we're working on right now is building a repository remediation service that, just would be deployed, just regular API kind of thing running on Kubernetes. And then there'd be two front ends to it. We use, if you're familiar with Backstage, the CNCF project Backstage internal developer portal, originally developed by Spotify. So anyway, that has a plug-in framework. So there'd be a plugin for that, so that for the humans, and then putting an MCP server in front of it for AI agents to use that. The other thing is that we're developing a policy enforcement stage for all the build pipelines, and which is talkable either warning or failure, and we'll have a link to the developer portal. Say, okay, here we're warning you, but next time it's going to fail. But if you'll just click this link over here, you can go fix it yourself. So that gets a lot of the pushes a lot of the management of getting this done out to the development teams themselves. And then once we get that working, then we'll have do an open rewrite recipe to insert this stage into all the build pipelines. So that'll be the last one that we got to do manual across all the repos. Over on the CGI side, we are developing an automated code remediation and refactoring service product offering, and on the lines of services of software, if you've ever heard of that, where basically it's you got AI to do, or new technology in general, in this case, to do 85% of the work, and then your smart people do the last 15%. And as part of that, we're developing an AI agent just for doing open rewrite recipe development. So you give it, here, I got this, and I want it to look like this. Go write me a recipe, kind of thing. So, and that's part of the service offering. And then we're developing a curriculum on automated code remediation, which includes the internal one for CGI would be include how to write recipes, how to run recipes, how to write recipes, and how to sell the service, kind of thing. So anyway, that's what that's what we're working on now. To close with, emphasize 4 points. So the first one is that the cost of doing modernization and remediations can be now magnitudes cheaper than it has ever been. And, and it's dropping rapidly. So you need to rethink things, because a lot of stuff that wasn't financially feasible, it's been sitting there to do on your to-do list for 20 years. You can go do it now, and you can afford to do it. Second one is this is not just a technology problem. There's a lot of organizational change. Management needs to go into it, and it's not just and it's not just like getting the teams to go do this. The other thing we're finding now that we're really like speeding things up is that we're exposing a lot of problems with other processes in the organization, where if you were doing 100 production deployments a week, then it's not a problem. You're doing 2,000 now, all of a sudden it's a problem. So there's to really realize all the benefits, you're going to have to do a lot of process change and a lot of organizational change. Third one, which I've emphasized, multiple times tonight is that, you know, don't focus on just AI agents, you know, because if you use the Open Rewrite or similar tools, then you do not have to check the changes they made. So it's a lot more efficient. And then the fourth one is that I've mentioned multiple times is that if you are a platform or framework team, every time you do a release, issue an Open Rewrite recipe to do the upgrade for the clients. And you can evolve your platform at a much, much faster rate than you've ever been able to do before. You don't have to like maintain backward compatibility for 3 years. It's just like, all right, we're dropping this in 2 months. Here's the recipe, go fix your stuff. You're not going to work unless you run this, you know. So it's a really powerful thing there. And so that's my presentation. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. There's my, there's the link there. And, you know, if you got problems, these kind of problems, we're always CGIs. You're available to help you solve them if you're interested. That's it. Now ready for more questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Kevin. This is excellent. I appreciate it, especially in the very, very beginning that you gave that little extra background. That was that's, you know, that's really good. I mean, we're gonna have people watching this on the on, you know, YouTube that are coming in cold, and this is going to be super helpful for understanding all this stuff. I'm sure we have multiple questions. Daryl always has questions. Maybe Mina will have some questions. I'm not sure. Go ahead.
Well, I have a question about how did you discover which recipes you needed across such mass repos?
With the first go around, it was pretty straightforward because you know, we had the really good release notes from the Java framework, and so we just go down line by line. You know, it's a, you know, for example, a good one would be we switched from Apache Commons libraries version 1 to version 3, for example. So, you know, okay, so, you know, well, I need to go change my check to see if those dependencies are directly listed in the POMs and change those, which there's a recipe for doing that. And then I need to change the package names on everywhere it's imported, and there's a recipe for that. You know, you can, a lot of those open source recipes are parameterized, so you'd have to, you know, you'd have multiple copies of that kind of thing. It's not like you'd have one recipe. You know, you use the same recipe, underlying recipe, but you parameterize it differently, and you end up with this long list of stuff. So it was,
Those were custom recipes you're saying, or there are already recipes out there to discover?
that stuff is,
in Apache
there's already
Commons?
recipes out there to do that. So
Yeah.
the custom recipes we just mainly needed to do for the internal library stuff, you know, that would be available, you know, because for open source stuff, there's recipes are available.
Cool.
So I do have a question. Let me type it in here. In the final slide, you said that the human review required is much less for the Open Rewrite updated code. So is that based on the data that you collect? How did we come to that conclusion?
So it was, you know, we just kind of knew how the teams operated. And so we could make a pretty good estimate of what it was going to take to, you know, to what it would do if they had to do it manually. We had a really good handle on that. So we would just use that. I mean, it's, you know, it's, you know, and it's not 100% concrete. You know, we didn't have like a database or something that said that, but, you know, we could come up with some good estimates that would be believable by anybody in the organization. And so then, then we would have actual data from, using the open rewrite to do it. And so we get a good comparison, how much savings there is.
Can't wait to try it out. Looks like there's also an IntelliJ plugin for the open rewrite. Have you guys used that one?
There's a IntelliJ plugin for Modern. I don't know. I don't know that I've ever used it. I don't know whether it does open. Well, I take that back. So JetBrains themselves has an open rewrite plugin.
Yeah.
Yes. That's for recipe development. Modern has an JetBrains plugin for managing the Modern platform.
Okay.
But yeah, the JetBrains plugin, yeah, that'll like do your highlighting of your composite recipe files, and that kind of stuff. So.
I also had a question.
Sure.
Regarding the recipe catalog, I noticed Python wasn't an available choice. Is there a reason for that? I know there's an open rewrite for Python on the GitHub repository, but it's not available
Yes.
as a catalog.
Yes. And there's two reasons for that. The first one is that when they first, a couple of years ago, like the hyperscalers were coming in and using these open source recipes and doing their own services. When they debuted Amazon Q at reInvent several years ago, they showed how you can use our agent to upgrade Java 8, Spring Boot 2.5 to the latest. And all they were doing, it was smoke and mirrors. All they were doing was going out and running open rewrite recipes in the background to do that originally. And so Modern got, worried about that. So they removed some of the most complex recipes from open source so that you had to, pay Modern to get to those. And then the second one, so I think that's what they're doing with a lot of the Python stuff. And second of all is that the Python, they've got they actually have some recipes available for Python, but they're still doing a lot of active development on that right now.
Okay, so I apologize. The active development is not open source, and most of the recipes are not free.
That's
basically.
correct for Python.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
I have a similar question, Kevin. The recipes that you developed for the migration for the Spring, and so those did eventually get back to open source, or not?
No, the custom recipes that we did, we didn't. There's a couple of those that we could, a lot of them were for internal stuff. There's a couple of them we could possibly open source, but we just haven't had the resources to do it.
So the platform team was not was it when you say platform team on the presentation, you're talking about an external company, or you're talking about your internal team?
No, this would be a client's internal platform team.
Got it. Okay. So yeah, I would imagine, yes, you have custom recipes for custom stuff that was done on these platforms. And there's always some homegrown stuff that would have to be custom, right?
Yeah.
There are a lot of varied languages, so Modern offers a lot of usable resources. I just was asking for a specific use case, but I'm very impressed with what I'm seeing. I just want to put that out there. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So what did the process look like for managing the mass scale of migrations? From meetings to, once you applied them? You know, how do you track which ones were being applied? Was that the Modern platform, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah.
Like the
So,
whole gamut.
Yeah, obviously, you know, a lot of that's, you know, every organization has their own culture and character. So, you know, a lot of it's going to have to be custom, you know, based on, you know, how you get things done at a particular organization. The Modern platform provides a lot of tools that make it much easier to do that. Beyond that, but you're going to have to do more than that. You know, you'll have some organizational change management to do somehow. Get people to actually use it. Once you get them going, I mean, at the particular client I was highlighting, there was a problem came up maybe a month ago now, I guess. And I was sitting in the meeting and it like involved like teams from across the organization, trying to figure that this was like a production problem. And, you know, somebody just piped up saying, oh, we need an open rewrite recipe to fix this now. So, you know, once you get it out there, you know, you're good to go, but it takes some work to do that. So.
Gotcha. Thank you.
I have a question too. As far as when you're training for recipe writers, what are you looking in terms of percentage for like headcount? Like 1 out of 20 developers would be a point person that would be knowledgeable for me to be able to write recipes. How does that look like?
I would say 1 in 5, maybe.
Wow. So yeah, so you need to have a good number of people that are familiar to be able to take care of stuff
Yeah,
with
A
with these
person on every
recipes.
team, basically.
yeah,
Looks that way. Sounds that way. Yeah.
yeah. And I don't know, maybe, you know, maybe with better training, you know, we could get that up. I know Modern's got some new trainings out and I haven't looked at them yet, but you know, people are working on it. So I don't know, maybe it will get easier. But that's kind of based on my experience, that's kind of where it is right now. So
Super helpful.
I have a comment on this. So Modern were visiting Toronto this winter, and they were presenting Open Rewrite, and one of the comments from them was, I believe it was Olga who mentioned it, that ChatGPT or any other like big LLM like Anthropic Claude is actually pretty good at writing the recipes. Like if you have a task, you know, you have the version A, like the source, and the version B, the target, you can fit it, these two, and say, hey, can you give me like a recipe? And it would do a decent job. And then you, of course, like need to tune it, polish it, but it could be a good start to actually, you know, start writing these recipes.
yeah,
Cool.
and that's exactly what we're doing with our AI agent. We're trying to get that so it's like very quick and very accurate.
What I'm struggling with is the recipe discovery. It seems like a big gap. And you know, you kind of have to understand the repos and what they're using and which recipes to apply, and that kind of counters the whole mass scale concept, if you ask me. So I'm not quite sure. I must be missing something in every meeting I've ever been to on Open Rewrite and Modern, where how do you do that? You know, like,
Yeah.
is it a painful process? I imagine
I
that.
didn't really find it that difficult. And
Yeah.
Modern, you know, the Modern platform now has their own AI agent that you can ask for.
Right. Madi. Yeah.
Yeah, Lottie.
Yeah, you mentioned mergers and acquisitions. I mean, like if you have many business units all using different Java frameworks,
Yep.
different Spring frameworks, like how you can't just create one recipe for that, right?
Right.
I mean, so you'd have to like divvy it up to these have this Java framework and these versions and only apply recipes for Spring Boot, whatever
Mhm.
upgrade, you know, for these set of, yeah, so there is a lot of work that goes into
Yeah,
that, I guess. Yeah.
There is.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's validating. Good.
You know, one of the things is you can bundle it up some because, you know, recipe, if it can't find anything that needs to fix, it's just a no-op. So it doesn't, you know, hurt anything to have it in there. But yes,
Gotcha.
you gotta do it, basically do it in stages and, you know what to apply it to.
And do you generally recommend to do certain recipe bundles first, like get Java upgraded, and maybe that requires a couple library upgrades or something, dependency upgrades, but then deploy that, see how it behaves, and then do the Spring Boot best practices, like all these other
Yeah,
things?
yeah. So like I mentioned, one of the things we found is what we had to do. The first thing to do is like fix your build systems so that, whatever that is, fix that first. And then, looking at the like Spring Boot upgrades and JDK upgrades. So, if you look at how that is, say that you're on, say Spring Boot 2.2 and Java 8. Well, you got to get Spring Boot upgraded to what, 2.6, I think, before you can do the JDK upgrade. But you can't go back past Spring Boot 2.7 to 3 until your JDK is upgraded. So it's like upgrade to a certain thing here on Spring Boot, and do JDK upgrade, and then do the rest of the Spring Boot upgrades. So yeah, that's a lot of stuff like
And you
that.
deploy that, and then you do another upgrade to like the later version. Yeah, okay,
Yeah.
gotcha. Interesting.
I got a suggestion for you, Daryl. I mean, I know this is, I did a presentation not too long ago about local LLMs. You could take the open rewrite documentation, download it, and put it in an LLM and ask it questions locally. The if complete open source, it would be Olama with OpenUI. But if you can cheat for a little while and not worry about the licensing, LM Studio is a GUI. You just install that, drop the documents in it, ask it questions, get started.
Yeah, it's a good idea. I know there is an AI discovery recipe that we were using. So it can at least look at your projects and tell you which recipes to run, but some of the guys at Modern didn't know about it yet, so they weren't really helping us with it, and it was not working, so they couldn't really help us as well because they've never really used it. And but yeah, that's a great idea. I like put it all together into one,
Yeah.
like we use GitHub Copilot, so that we could just use that as well. So
You could use that. You could use that as well. Obviously, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, but it's like quick and dirty. LM Studio is just you just drop the documents as document sets, and then you can just ask it questions on the document sets, whatever it is that you need, and it gets you started. You know, of course, you could do this in a much more enterprise way. But that's like something on your own desktop that you can just drag and drop. If you run it on a Mac, on an M2, M1, M3 Mac, they run pretty quickly. If it's on a PC, you need an NVIDIA card. But on a Mac, they run very, very well.
New to this one. Thank you for the excellent presentation, sharing your experience, Kevin. What comes to my mind is, system refactored using these recipes, with support. Have you guys come across any issues in production when the system that was rewritten, refactored, released to production after the fact? Have you guys run into any kind of runtime issues and so forth that was due to any of these refactorings or rewrites?
Not as far as application code on the Kubernetes, the resource request changes. There was, I'm not sure whether any of them made it to production. I think maybe one made it to production, but because they were supposed to do performance testing beforehand, but there was some weird stuff went on with some of that, just because they didn't understand. Like the one that broke, it's like, well, we reduced our CPU requests and we ran out of memory. It's like, okay, kind of thing. So we set it back because now it works. So, but other than that, no. As far as just changing code, no. I don't know any.
Especially when you deal with the Spring Framework, right? All those spilling beans all over the place,
Yeah.
right? Anything can go wrong anywhere. So
Yeah.
that'll be interesting, kind of like a case study to hear, someone updating the Spring Framework, Spring application using this method and running the whole system in production to see, how things are coming along well.
Yeah, that stuff's gone really well, that kind of stuff. Recipes kind of cover everything.
It's very
If it
encouraging.
compiles, you're good to go.
So it's very encouraging. So, we should give it a try. Yeah.
Yeah, like what's the room for building it into CI/CD pipelines, right? Kind of like the Dependabot, but taking it a step
Yeah.
further. Is anyone discussing this kind of thing? And I might have come across that at the Modern conference at the
I have not seen that myself.
I would think that's kind of the next phase. I know when I saw the talk about security, it was building that, shifting left, building that into the pipelines and automatically, changing security, the code for security vulnerabilities. But I imagine we should be doing that as well as soon as a new recipe is available and or framework.
But
And
but think about how that works. You gotta, so what, I kick off a build pipeline, it says, oh, I need to change the code, so it creates a PR. And then you gotta come back, approve the PR, and then kick off the build pipeline again.
just like any other change, I suppose.
Yeah.
I guess it's more for continuous upgrading versus
Yeah.
this mass scale kind of. I see it two ways because my company is like 27,000 people, but not everyone's developer, not engineering, right? And I don't know if it's big enough development engineering to kind of have a centralized team that's managing this stuff. From JPMC, I saw it was like a team of less than 10 engineers. You're saying you had 5. So it seems like you really need a team that's dedicated to this full time to get everyone on board, and maybe they continue it on. But like that's what I'm thinking. Maybe
Yeah,
CI/CD
it's
build
just kind of a
pipelines too.
scale thing, if you've got hundreds or thousands of engineering teams, then, it kind of pays to have a dedicated team.
Yeah.
You got 3, probably not.
And with CGI, the AI stuff you're saying you're doing, is that a product that you're selling, or that's just for internal?
It's not a product yet, but that's where I'm trying to hit us. But
Gotcha.
we
Yeah.
haven't rolled it out yet.
I think you'll get business on that. I mean, you get business already from all sorts of stuff. So just another revenue stream for you guys.
Yeah. That's the plan.
Mm-hmm. People would need.
And one of the things I like about, I think that it fits good for us is that, there's not a lot of knowledge transfer on that. I mean, it's just like you could, that's something you could outsource, and you don't really have to worry about the knowledge transfer because, your engineering team's just going on and delivering features, and boom, here comes this PR to upgrade everything, and you understand what it is without, having to learn anything. Just merge it, keep going. So I think there's a lot of opportunities there for something like that. If somebody just takes care of that for you, you can focus on the stuff that differentiates you, makes you money.
Does it lose the ability to keep knowledgeable about what new features to use from all these frameworks and languages? I wonder too, because you can just upgrade Java and then continue on your merry way using an old.
The recipes reuse, syntax appropriate for the JDK version. So Jonathan, the Open Rewrite founder, mentioned about when he sees these things being rewritten, he sometimes sees things that he didn't know in the language existed. Because it's like so many things to keep up with, right? So even the execution of the recipes, they do modernization of syntax stuff, and they update to not just the syntax, but some of the calls themselves, the methods that didn't exist previously. So it's, you learn stuff from just even that. I think we're good. I haven't seen you guys this quiet.
All right.
So I think it's I think we're good and time wise. I think it did exactly what I wanted to do here, is make sure that, you know, this information, once I post it, you know, to get this message out, people to understand how it's used, you know, you put a little team together, go execute, get a beachhead, start migrating, incorporate it into your CI/CD pipeline. All this information is, it's just a matter of time before it gets out there, Kevin. So I think you're the kind of like the close to the tip of the spear as far as getting this out. And this will be helpful for a lot of companies to be able to keep up.
Yeah, I learned a lot. Thank you. It's really good to hear examples from the ground, you know, like real world examples
You're welcome.
actually being applied.
Absolutely excellent. I mean, so like again, Kevin, I, you know, really appreciate sharing this and you know, helping us all understand this is the obviously this is the wave of the future. It's just other people may not know it yet. And so the sooner that people understand, the more that they don't have to face the security issues, you know, and get bitten in the behind with this proactive recipes execution to fix our stuff.